Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm beginning to go through the PowerPoints for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 Web Programming with C# 2015 6th edition, and I'm in Chapter 1. Chapter 1, as you can see, is entitled An Introduction to ASP.NET Programming. Now, as oftentimes happens in textbooks, in the first chapter or two, the author attempts to present almost everything that's going to be covered in this book. So if you feel a little bit overwhelmed, don't. It's okay. It's all stuff that we'll go over. Our objectives: describe the components of a web application, describe the four components of a URL, and also what happens when you omit a file name from a URL when you request a web page, be able to distinguish or differentiate between static and dynamic web pages, be able to distinguish between the internet and an intranet, describe HTTP request, HTTP response, and round trip, distinguish between ASP.NET Web Forms applications and MVC or Model View Controller applications, and describe the three types of environments that can be used for developing ASP.NET applications. List the software components that you need on your own PC if you want to develop and run ASP.NET web apps. Describe the class library and what's known as the CLR or Common Language Runtime of the .NET framework. Finally, distinguish between the ASPX files and the code behind files in an ASP.NET web app. So throughout this book, what the author will be working with is an application that's already been created for you that's called the Halloween Superstore. This is an example of an order page. If you were to click the drop-down list that's right here where it says Flying Bats currently, when you click that, it would show you other products. So for instance, I know there's like a Freddy Krueger something or other, mask or something. So if you choose that, then the picture would change, the big description and small description would change, conceivably the price could change. Once you find the product you like, you can select the quantity that you want, and if you click Add to Cart, it will indeed add that to your cart. If you click Go to Cart, it will change from this page, which is our order page, to the actual cart page, which is here. When you're at the cart page, as you can see, you've got your choice. You can click Checkout, which it will not be implemented for a while yet, to check out your order. You can click Continue Shopping to go back to your order page. You can highlight an item and click Remove Item to remove that item from your shopping cart, or you can click none of the items and choose Empty Cart to remove everything from your shopping cart. So that's the app that's going to be built throughout the text by the authors. Now, as far as the components of a web application, this is an interesting photo because in the past, what you saw in it were computer, computer, and computer. And although that is what you still see, because a tablet is a computer, a smartphone is a computer, but it really shows the insurgence, so to speak, of the mobile web app revolution, and the fact that tablets and smartphones are on the same level as a desktop or laptop computer. So you've got any one of these three clients, as we'll refer to them, a desktop or laptop computer, a tablet, or a smartphone, making requests over the internet. Those requests are eventually going to be handled by some kind of a web server somewhere. That web server may be able to handle the request itself, or that web server may have to go and pass that request on to yet another server to do some work. So it can come back to that web server so that it can go back through the internet and go back either to the user's smartphone, tablet, or laptop, desktop computer. Now, when you type in something like what you see on the screen right here, http:// www.modulemedia.com/ourwork/index.html. You'll notice a few things. The first, as you can see in the delineation here, you've got http://. This says that you are going to be making what's referred to as a hypertext transfer protocol request. That's exactly what this is. Sometimes instead of HTTP, you see HTTPS, which means that you're trying to make a more secure request. All right. Sometimes instead of HTTP or HTTPS, you'll see FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. For now, all we're going to care about is the protocol of choice for us right now will be HTTP, followed by the colon and the //. Next is the domain name. So if I wanted to do something similar to this for Rankin Technical College, it would be http://www.rankin.edu as an example. All right, and most people are pretty familiar with domain names and extensions, the most common being .com, .net, .gov, .edu, .mil, etc. And there are plenty of them. Then you've got a path. So in other words, underneath this modulemedia.com, there's another folder called Our Work. And under that folder is a file that's called index.html. The only other thing to mention right here is when you see something that ends in .html at the end of your path, like you do right here, that's bringing up what's referred to as a static web page. It's a web page that probably doesn't change often. It's a web page that literally may never change. So if I was going to go and create a very simple website, let's say back in 2015, I took a trip with my family and I decided that I wanted to take those photos, put them out there on the internet for friends and family and the like to see. So I got my own domain name, and I don't plan on ever having this change. I'm going to post this stuff and it'll stay out there maybe forever, maybe for a year or two, it doesn't matter. But if I use index.html, the idea is that's a static file, not a transient file. Here's an example of a static web page because it ends with .html. So the chances are pretty good that I could come back to this particular site tomorrow or the next day, maybe even the next year, and it would look exactly as it looks right now. That's the staticness. When you've got a static web page, it's pretty simple as far as what it shows here. Again, where it shows web browser, that is a desktop or laptop, but again, it could just as easily be a tablet or a mobile phone. All right. The user types an address into his or her address bar, which is what you see up here. So for instance, if I typed in http://www.rankin.edu, that's an example. All right, and if I hit enter, it brings me up to Rankin Technical College's homepage. All right, as an example. All right, but the idea is when we're doing this, the web browser makes a hypertext transfer protocol request. It's typically a simple request, so the request is answered by a web server who has to send back the HTTP response using HTML because that's what the browser can understand. So it is a request response type of setup with the client or user in his or her address bar keying in their hypertext transfer protocol request and the web server on its end coming back with a hypertext transfer protocol response. Now, you already saw one like this already because this is the same page that we saw at the beginning here. The only difference is rather than choosing flying bats, we have now chosen deranged cat. So again, That changed, which meant the picture changed, which meant the large heading and small heading information changed, and in this case, the price changed. All right? But the idea with a dynamic web page is there's more work involved. All right, as I mentioned to you before, there's a good chance that the web server can't do everything that the hypertext transfer protocol request from the client asks for. So the web server has to call other servers. And you notice how all of that information goes and flows in both directions. Now, the majority of this book, really, other than chapter 25, the last chapter of the book, is going to be using ASP.NET Web Forms. So literally, probably 96% of this book is on ASP.NET using web forms. We'll get into these more in more depth and breadth of coverage later on in the book. The differences between them: ASP.NET Web Forms in some ways, in many ways, are going to be like what we did in the C# class using Windows Forms. They're a little bit more complex and there are some differences. ASP.NET MVC, or Model View Controller, is similar to the MVC type of design pattern, which is what it's known as, that's used in other languages. So we'll look at that a little bit later. Now, in the ASP.NET in the C# class, we generally did web applications. You can read all about those right here. It's no big thing one way or the other. In this particular book, we're going to be creating website projects. So as it says, there's no project file. All of the files are going to be in the root directory. We'll look at this a little bit later. That's included with a website. The files are individually deployed to a web server. The site is dynamically compiled the first time the site is asked for. So if you're going to do this work at home, or if you're going to do it at school, but especially for Wentzville, where you need to use your own laptop, you'll need Windows 7 or later, .NET Framework 4.5 Visual Studio 2015, IIS Express, and the SQL Server Express Local DB. We'll talk about some of those later on as we get going in here. All right. So as it says, for your PC, you'll need Windows 7 or later, which shouldn't be an issue, the .NET Framework 4.6, and Visual Studio 2015. Speaking of Visual Studio 2015, you can yourself go out to visualstudio.com, or if you want to be even more specific, visualstudio.com/downloads, and that'll bring you to the download page. For this class, you have to download, all right, this is Visual Studio Express, but it's now referred to as the Community Edition. Do not download 2017 RC, which means Release Candidate. Rather, choose Community 2015. So from all the ones that are up here, under the free download, choose 2015. These you can download a free trial for a month, but then you're kind of hosed after that. So we want 2015. Now I can only go to a certain point in here because I already have 2015 installed on my machine. Not only that, I've got a better copy. I've got what's called the Enterprise Edition. So it says, fine, let us know where we can send tips. That's up to you. All right. I already get tips from them, so I'm just going to click right here. So it says, get started, learn coding, or collaborate now. Well, what we're more concerned with is getting started. Okay? But you may or may not have noticed, I've got this here now. what happened when I chose that is it's given me an executable of the download of the Visual Studio 2015 community. All right. So if you do all this and you choose run like this, the system's going to sit and think about it. All right. And I don't know why it's not doing anything, but it'll attempt to run. Mine, again, I can only go to a certain place. It was aborted. That's what I want because I already have it on my system. If you do that and you accept all of the defaults and you say that you want your language of choice to be C#, if you're asked to do that, what will happen is what you will have then when you click your Windows Start button, and if you go down to almost the very bottom, you'll find Visual Studio 2015, and you'll have a little icon that looks like this. If you click that, that will start up Visual Studio. Again, mine is the Enterprise Edition, so mine will look a little different than yours will look. And here are the differences between them. The Professional and the Enterprise, you have to pay for. The community is free for you to download and use, and it'll be more than sufficient for what we have to do for this class. All right. So what you see here is a picture of the .NET framework. C#, and in particular in our case, ASP.NET C# is part of the Microsoft .NET framework. At the top level, as you can see, you've got Visual Basic, what they call Visual C#, Visual C++, and Visual F#. The only one we care about is this second one here, Visual C#. Underneath that, you've got the .NET Framework class library, which has got everything that you're well, I shouldn't say everything, but most everything that you're going to need in order to be able to build applications. Underneath that is the Common Language Runtime. Now, although it's not directly the same, it's very similar. The .NET CLR, Common Language Runtime, is very similar to the virtual machine in Java. All right? And as you can see, it's got managed applications, the common type system, and the intermediate language. There's much more about this in your book. And if I look in the book, I'm up to page 16, 17. As they mentioned there, .NET applications work by using services of the .NET framework, which in turn accesses the operating system and the hardware on an as-needed basis. The .NET framework consists of two main components, the .NET class library, which again, right here, provides pre-written code that are known as classes that are available for anything you might want to do. It also contains underneath that the CLR, or Common Language Runtime. The CLR manages the execution of .NET programs. The common type system that you see right there is a component of the CLR. It ensures that all .NET applications use the same data type. When you go and you compile, this is a compile language, when you compile your Visual C# programs, they get compiled into what's called MISL, which is the Microsoft Intermediate Language, or sometimes just called the Intermediate Language. Now, when you start working with this stuff, and it gets a little bit tricky here, you start talking about system state, okay? Now, you may or may not be aware of this, but let's say, for example, that I go out onto the internet, and I go out to Amazon.com. And I decide that I want to grab this book right here. And I want to grab it, and I want to add it to my cart. All right? So notice there's nothing currently in my cart. And if I grab all this and I say add to cart, now there is something in my cart. All right? What has happened here is Amazon has set up what's called a session with me. In other words, it's keeping track of what I'm trying to do. But if I come back in and start up another instance and go back to Amazon again, you'll notice I do have the one item in my cart, but if I come in there and I start doing something totally different, as far as as far as Amazon is concerned, when I'm looking through here for different things, I'm another user. Okay? And the reason for that is the hypertext transfer protocol is what's called a stateless protocol. So the system that's basically doing what you want it to do, for lack of better words, is dumb. It only does what it knows how to do. So you're sitting there as it's shown in the picture here, and this is page 19 in the book. You're the client. You make an HTTP or a hypertext transfer protocol request. This is you going in and in your address bar typing in the URL for some website. All right. Next, the web server answers. So it returns the requested page using HTML, and then as far as the system is concerned, the application has ended. So if the browser goes and requests another page, the server has no way of knowing that request came from the same browser that requested this. And the example I gave you was more or less a poor example. But let's look and say that I'm here. So I'm at rankin.edu. All right. Then I come through here, and in the same thing here, I go back to the school I used to work at, which is blackhawk.edu. All right. And what you see, the system has no idea that these requests came from two different machines. That's because of right here, as mentioned here, when I make my next request, the server has no way to associate the browser making this request with the browser that made that request. Okay? So we're going to talk more about session state, as you can see, in several chapters. We'll talk a little bit about view state in the next chapter, but more in Chapter 8. Session state a little bit in Chapter 4, but more in Chapter 8. Application state in Chapter 8. Server-side caching in Chapter 8. And a little bit about user accounts in Chapter 20. So as we start in here, we're going to create this application. It's called a future value application. What this means is if you invest $50 a month, and do the math, which means $600 a year, and if you do that over 10 years at 3%, after the 10 years, you will have your future value, so your $6,000 investment will now be worth $7,004.54. You can figure that out by clicking the calculate button. You can click clear to have all of the stuff that's in here go away, and this set to whatever the default is. We'll also, in the next chapter, talk about a little bit about validation controls. So you'll notice we put an interest rate that was out of range because our valid interest rate is 1% to 20%, and we didn't put in a number of years. So we actually had two errors that were flagged on here. We'll talk about those and how you handle those with validation controls starting in the next chapter. This is our project that is brought up in Visual Studio 2015. We'll talk about that also more in the next chapter. You'll notice that as we create a project, and these are some of the files that you can see up here in what's called our Solution Explorer area, right where I've got the mouse going nuts here. These are some of the files that we're going to work with. Default.aspx, which is our default page. Default.aspx.cs, which is what's called the code behind file for that default.aspx page. Default.aspx.designer.cs, which is the associated generated C# code. Web.config, which is an XML or extensible markup language file that contains package and other information, and in this case also a JPEG file in our images folder. These first four were in our root folder. We'll talk about what all this means as we go on, but this is going to be the logo image for the form, and that's this right here, your books. So the code that you see here is on page 25. Now it's really important to realize that this code that you see right here, this is ASPX code, which means it's not C# code per se. This right here that you see in the top line here, this can all be put in one line, but the author separated it into two so you can read it easier. This is called an ASP.NET directive. An ASP.NET directive allows you to put ASP.NET code in non-ASP.NET files. So this says that the language we're using is C#, that we're going to automatically wire it up, and we'll talk about this in a later chapter. Our file is named default.aspx, so by default, no pun intended, our code behind file is called default.aspx.cs. All right? And it's going to inherit from this file. But if you look, everything else in here, and I mean everything else in here, is just HTML code. Inside of that HTML code, we're going to have some new things. We're going to have different controls that are prefaced with ASP colon, and we're going to have something that says run at equals server. What run at equals server means, and they must each have their own unique ID, but what that means is they are server-side controls as opposed to client-side controls that we have been using up till this point in our training. All right, and then finally, and this is shown, this is the last couple slides, but this is what's shown in your book on page 27. This is C# code. Now, I don't expect you to understand what the if, not is postback mean, but we'll talk about it starting in the next chapter. This says basically if our form passes all validation checks, then do this stuff. And that's going to be what runs when our calculate button is clicked. Here we're writing a separate, we are writing a separate function, method, whatever you want to call it. That's right here. This is what happens when we press the clear button. So this code that you see here, that code is what happens when you press this button. The code that you see here is what happens when you press the clear button. All right, I know I ran through that quickly, but hopefully that just makes sense to you. All right, so that's it for this chapter. When we get to the next chapter, chapter 2, which starts in your textbook on page 31, in chapter 2, we will talk about how to develop a one-page application where we'll actually develop from scratch, the Muroc future value. Okay, there it is. Okay, so I'll be back, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bop back and forth between the PowerPoint slides and Visual Studio, and I'm going to build this for you. You'll have this code already, but I think you should even key it in because the only way to learn this stuff is to do this stuff. All right, so I'll be back with my lecture for Chapter 2 shortly.